nós entendemos que dentro de um projeto de país que busca cada vez mais o aprofundamento democrático, o debate em torno da elaboração normativa e a participação popular em torno desse processo, seja por meio do Congresso Nacional, seja também pela atuação do Executivo, é algo essencial para o avanço democrático. E o Projeto Pensando Direito é o nosso veículo para aproximar a população nesse processo de elaboração normativa, trazendo por meio de uma mudança qualitativa antes verificada, antes resolvida basicamente com a busca por grandes intelectuais do nosso país para contribuir nesse processo e abrindo para que a universidade, grupos de pesquisa pudessem contribuir nesse processo e construir conosco esse processo. E não há como fazer esse processo sem ter o devido intercâmbio com as experiências internacionais. Então nós estamos aqui com uma das maiores autoridades no assunto, que é o professor Wim Voermans, que além de ser professor da Universidade de Leiden, na Holanda, é professor de Direito Constitucional e Direito Administrativo, presidente da Associação Internacional de Legislação, trabalhou com inúmeros trabalhos junto à Comissão Europeia e OCDE e, portanto, traz aqui para a nossa discussão uma experiência que é fundamental para que nós possamos, guardadas as peculiaridades do nosso país, mas entender e absorver elementos que podem sim ser essenciais para o nosso processo de evolução no debate legislativo, no debate da produção legislativa, na análise do impacto das normas, enfim, não há nada mais fundamental nesse processo de desenvolvimento do que um intercâmbio, e de um intercâmbio que nos faça sempre buscar a reflexão, avaliar de forma dialética os processos e intervir na nossa realidade, sempre referenciado em boas experiências e na nossa realidade.
I jumped at the opportunity to visit Brazil. This is my first time here, and I was very curious after what I began to call for myself the Brazilian miracle. There will be something maybe in the press later on, but I visited last year China, I visited India, the BRIC countries, and was there on a sort of the same mission as I was here. They wanted some expertise and things like that. But the one country I was really amazed by, if you look at the figures of what Brazil did the last 10 years, sparing economic growth with an advancement of the population, with doing away with a lot of inequality, trying to overcome poverty. And you're to be applauded for that, because these other countries, they grow economically very fast as well. They're in a sort of a big development, but I think, to my mind, Brazilians, the development in Brasilia is very, it gives a lot of hope, and is very well balanced, if you ask me. But let's rest it at that. But I jumped at the opportunity to be here, and of course the theme you asked me here for was very interesting as well. The general idea was to discuss topics of legislation, but when Fabio first contacted me, the idea was to see how academic research can link up with the practice of legislation. And one would say, listen, we are making legislation and regulation for more than 4,000 years, ever since Hammurabi or something like that. So that will be a well-advanced discipline then in academia. Actually, it is not. And that is what is at the core of what I wanted to share with you today. If we think of enforcement and compliance of regulation, then one would think that there must have been a lot of research on why people actually obey the law and what methods of enforcement work well and what kind of methods of enforcement do not work. Actually, that's not the case. There has not been a lot of academic research, empirical research, on why it is that people obey the law. We work on a hunch, and the hunch is this, the idea, the hypothesis. We have a law, and if you increase the penalty, or have a penalty, it will deter people. And if you stiffen the penalty, then people will be even more deterred. And if you catch the criminals, everybody will see, and then nobody will try to trespass the law. Actually, that is not what it works, and this is what I wanted to share with you. I'm going to take you tonight on a sort of an experiment. And the object of the experiment, or the subjects of the experiment, are you yourself. So, time and time again, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask you after your motives. And try to ask yourself now, why is it I obey the law? Why is it I obey the law? Or why is it I will not obey the law? What's my motive there? So ask yourself that. That will be the sort of a running experiment throughout this speech on motive-based enforcement. Okay then. If we talk about law or legislation, we know that compliance is vital. And why is that? Rules and regulations that are not observed are in the end futile. Why bother? If you have rules and regulations that are not complied with, then the whole exercise is useless. Lon Fuller, you might have heard of him, a big legal philosopher, put it like this. He says, there are two sides of the thing. For law to be effective, first of all, the lawgiver must be able to anticipate acceptance and compliance by legal subjects. So you must be a sort of a polity. You must be a sort of a constitutional entity. That's the level of acceptance. So if a state, and you have some states in the world, maybe you know in Mali and in countries like Morocco, they have a part of the desert that's no longer under control of Morocco. These lawgivers in Morocco can no longer expect that their laws will be abided by. But generally, lawgivers must be able, in a legal order, to anticipate acceptance and compliance with their rules. And on the other hand, legal subjects must be able to anticipate that the government enforces law. That gives them the trust they need to be able to live in a legal order governed by the rule of law. That's the basic trust you have, that the government will enforce the rule it issues. Failure to realize either of these two expectations, Lon Fuller says, threatens the functioning of the law system as a whole. But then one could argue, what does Lon Fuller know? He lives in a very well-established state, and this is theory, we all agree to that. But now comes in some empirical evidence, and I brought it from the Netherlands, but it does not stand alone. The idea is that if you allow non-compliant behavior, we did the experiment in the workshops we had last week, that a strange thing happens. First of all, say for instance you have speed limits throughout Brasilia, like we have in the Netherlands or in any other country. And say for instance you were no longer able to control whether these speed limits were met with, so control traffic and do that, and it became officially known. Then there is a very strange phenomena they found out in Sweden, that the tax morale relaxes too. These two are totally unconnected. So, speed limits, tax law, these are totally unconnected areas of policy domains. But if you cannot enforce rules and traffic limits, people will feel free not to pay their taxes as well. And you all know this when you go to a party or something like that, people say, listen, there are people among us who do not pay their taxes. I feel free now too to relax with some rules. That's how human psychology. The basic trust that everybody abides by these rules is then made very vulnerable. And we are very, we can sense that in the air. But now for a study, it's called by Kees Keizer, and he did a study, and it was in all other countries too. It's called The Spreading of Disorder. And he found out that compliant behavior of these is greatly influenced by the fact whether or not these addressees, these subjects, observe care and respect of others, fellow citizens, for these and indeed more generally other norms. That is a social phenomenon which makes compliance very vital. I here give you, we did an experiment in the workshop on the smoking ban at Schiphol Airport when I came back in 1999 from Australia. I will not go into that, it will take too much time. But here you see something typically Dutch. These signs say, don't park your bike. Strictly forbidden to park your bike. And you see the bikes standing there. The spreading of disorder, he gave it as a title. Why do people actually obey the law? I will come to that in a moment. But for any strategy or policy on enforcement to be successful, one should really understand why people obey the law. But actually, most of the time, present-day enforcement strategies are based on general notions, instincts and intuition as regards compliance and compliant behavior, and not on proven theory or empirical evidence. And my central thesis today will then be threefold. First of all, enforcement strategies could improve, be more effective by better understanding why people obey the law, or in mirror image, why people trespass law, why do they do that, understand that. Secondly, that we can use proven theory and empirical evidence for that. There's a lot of recent research into human nature around and the way it affects compliance at this moment. And that, as the last point, government can benefit from motive-based enforcement strategies. If we want to understand compliance, we need to understand human nature. One would say that's a bit far off, a question like that, human nature, and not in the department of psychology or something like that. No, but I think we must avow that in law, we work with theories and ideas on human nature which are quite old. In constitutional law, we work with, to understand why we have constitutional law of a certain sort, we work with ideas that are basically 400 or 500 years old. That's the contract theories. The idea on human nature, especially the one by Mr. Hobbes, is very important. So why did people go and live in states? And why did they come up with constitutions? And why do they accept rule? There's a central concept in it, with John Locke as well, Rousseau as well, that Thomas Hobbes put it like this, that basically all humans are violent. He's famous for his quote, "Life is short, nasty and brutish." And that's because all of us are violent and not prone to altruism, we need a sort of a Leviathan, a big governor, a king, a ruler that represents all of us, sort of an arbiter that can rule us. That is a view on human nature. That is a view on how states emerged and how constitutions work. Basically, you have his line of thinking in all sorts of contract theory. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book last year called The Origins of Political Order, whereby he says this idea is a fallacy. It's not true. That's not how states emerged. And he goes around the world looking from China, India, Western Europe, you name it, on how it actually worked, especially in the Middle East, very important. I praise this book, it's a very good book, but I will not dwell into that. But this idea of, you might have heard the Latin homo homini lupus est. We are all competitors of one another. That is underlying a lot of ideas we have on constitutional law and law at this moment. And then in this thinking, based on the idea that all humans are not friends but competitors and prone to violence, then law and government are a sort of a gates or reins that keep our innate violent nature in check. That's the main perception. And then you should hear the debates in the American Congress, then you will hear echoes of this, that government basically cannot trust its citizens. That comes with the package. So you need to enforce, you need to be there, you need to control them, you need to check them, because people basically have a violent nature. Now for proven theory. Steven Pinker. He has had a book out since 2 years, and it's called The Better Angels of Our Nature, why violence actually has declined over the course of human civilization. That's actually what happened. If you tell that to anybody or a politician, they will say, no, 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 no. No, that's not the case. Violence is rising. Actually, it's not, if you look at the data. But our tolerance for violence is diminishing very rapidly. So politicians are not lying when they say that, or people are not lying when they say that. But actually, violence has dramatically declined. This is his book. This is Mr. Pinker himself. What does he do in this wonderful book, 1,000 pages? He debunks the myth about violence and our nature. Tries to look at the psychological evidence, the biological evidence, you name it, and all of the data. And a lot of these myths he debunks are at the heart of our public policies on fighting crime and enforcing law. What kind of myth does he debunk then? First of all, he asks himself, are humans, are they innately violent, like Hobbes depicted? And the other one is the hydraulic theory of violence, the idea that all humans harbor a sort of an inner drive toward aggression and criminal behavior, which builds up and must periodically be discharged. And Pinker says, on the basis of his analysis, nothing could be further from a contemporary scientific understanding of the psychology of violence. It's really not the case that humans are innately violent and this hydraulic theory of violence. Actually, historically, we have seen a steep decline of violence. And then you see on the top war crime, and then you have homicides, and then infanticides. There's no thing for that. So has really declined over the years. The one thing that really shocked me was that, what would you say that hunter-gatherers who lived, say for instance, 6,000 years BC, what the chance was? They lived for 30 years, something like that. Their chance of a violent death, including women, children, everybody. Chance of violent death. They did a calculation of that. Hunter-gatherers. So when we, the last of the Stone Age, you still have people in New Zealand living like that, here in the Amazon, hunter-gatherers, the chances of a violent death. We had the idea that they lived in paradise and they had a wonderful life and they ate fruit and they had pickings. Their life was better than in the agricultural society. 1 in 3, 30% died a violent death before the age of 30. Then Pinker has this notion on human nature. He derives from different analysis that humans are not actually innately good, just as they are not innately evil, but they come equipped with motives that can orient them away from violence and toward cooperation and altruism. And these motives have been there in human society and have caused this steep decline. And in a nice metaphor, he says, actually we have 5 inner demons and 4 better angels. What then are the 5 inner demons? Important to note. Pinker says that aggression, or criminal behavior for that matter, is not a single motive, but the output of several psychological systems that differ in their environmental triggers, their internal logic, their neurological basis, and their social distribution. That's all very complicated, as he puts it. But then, if you see the 5 sorts of violence, aggression, or criminal behavior, one of them is what we call the predatory or instrumental violence. It's using violence as a means to an end. So, a professional criminal would do that, for instance. But the other ones are important as well. Dominance, for instance, the urge for authority, prestige, glory, or power, that used to be very prominent as a source of violence. Not all that important anymore. Revenge, a source of violence, an inner demon. Moralistic urge towards retribution. Sadism, pleasure in another one's suffering, and ideology, the shared belief and the idea that violence is justified sometimes. We have 4 better angels as well. For instance, empathy, to be able to stand in the shoes and feel feelings for someone else, or feel sympathy. Self-control, we have that too. Moral sense and reason. These are the 4 better angels. And they are very important when it comes down to compliance. If you can play on these motives, then you kiss awake the better angels. So why do we comply? Now we turn to modern regulatory theory. There are 2 main theories in regulatory theory. That's the first is the principal actor theory, and the second is the constructivist theory. What is the principal actor theory? That departs from the notion that the principal actor to compliance is the government or the administration itself. And that administrative effort, if you as a government invest heavily in enforcement activities, that will inspire then compliance. You can do that by communicating, due process, and actually enforcing, coercive strategy, sanctioning. The 2 schools in the principal actor theory. First of all, there's the rational perspective. We call that the enforcement school. Departs from the idea that people are rational, and they make a cost-benefit analysis on their chances of being caught, or the benefit they will have if they trespass. And so this, because people are rational and make cost-benefit analysis, only a coercive strategy of monitoring and sanctioning will foster compliance. Then you have the management perspective. You all will know that as well. Departs from the idea that people are rational beings, but non-compliance is not always the result of a deliberate defiance of the rules. Sometimes you defy them by accident, or you did not know the rule. So non-compliant behavior does not always need to be remedied then by enforcement and sanctions, but may also be secured by remedial forms of administrative action, information, assistance, simplifying the rules, communicating them better, things like that. And then we have the constructive theory. And in the constructive theory, we have 3 basic tenets. That compliance is dependent on the way regulatory norms tie in or align with the beliefs of the addressee, the motives. And that the main driver of change is not external. If you have law, that the main driver for behavioral change is not external by administrative action or sanctions, but internal, the socialization and the internalization of the rule by the addressees. And if regulators succeed in convincing a rule is good, necessary, legitimate, compliance will follow. Question to you. What do you think? This constructivist theory, is government succeeding in doing it like this? So, is government succeeding in just tying in with your beliefs so you will abide by the rules, or do you need strict action for the most of your rules? It's about the bulk of the rules. Say, let's set it at 100%. Do you need then this action, government action, principal actor theory says you should coerce, maybe remedial, but you should do something. Because otherwise there will be no compliance. And this constructivist theory says you can do whatever you want, but it'll only work better if you tie in with the beliefs of the people. Actually, I think the constructivist, if you look at the data, they are right. Ask yourself, how many rules do you know from Brazilian law? And we will do the experiment in a few moments again. How many rules do you know? And how many times do you trespass in a week? Willfully? I think most of you don't. So something has happened. You don't know the rules, but you're able to comply. That's internalization for you. So I think for 80% out of 100% of the law any developed country has, not like in Azerbaijan. I always take I poke fun with Azerbaijan, but I will resist that at this moment. But for any well-developed country, I think 80% runs itself. We believe in the law. We're strong believers in the law. And we have methods and means and a radar for deciding what the correct behavior is, and we will comply if we can help it. What we do not want, and we get very angry about it, if people trespass. If even only a small portion of people get away with some advantage of not complying with the rules, and you're the one having to comply with the rules. There's a sort of a basic trust in the legal order, sort of a contract between government and its citizens, that the most important agreements we establish in law, and we work on the basis that we must be able to trust government to enforce, but that our fellow citizens will also abide by the law. That gives a basic trust that we really need for our sort of societies to be able to work. So the constructivists have a point, but they have a fatal weakness as well. It offers no short-term answers to big compliance problems. So, with a constructive theory in mind, you cannot fight crime like robbery rates or something like that. It will not really help you. If you have professional criminals there, they are not all that constructivist by nature. The point then, tying in with beliefs. I discuss with you. First of all, we need to acknowledge that law is a belief system. When I tell that to my bachelor students, they always became looking very seriously, and I say, okay then, give me the law. And they come with a book. I said, no, that's just the off-print of the idea of law. So that's not the law. What is the law then? Discuss it among yourself. Law basically is a belief. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. And we abide by the law, and there you can see it, because we believe we have to. Not only from morality, because morals can differ, but in a legal order, in a well-established state, we believe in the law, and we abide by the law because we believe we have to, and other members of society or state actors remind us we ought to. So you're constantly reminded of what the public morality is. And regulation uses intervening in markets, in society, by rules. Regulation uses the law as its vehicle, and by that appeals to the beliefs of its addressees. And that a very important concept, the vehicle we use for that, is the rule of law. We, in a democracy, in a well-established legal order, we believe that we must be ruled by law, because we think law is very important, and that we have a sort of a public agreements on that level. And the legitimacy concept of the rule of law says government abides by the law, the citizens abide by the law, and government will do its utmost to uphold the law. These are the three elements of the rule of law. That brings us to Tom Tyler. He has researched this in his book, world-famous book, Why Do People Obey the Law? And what you see here, that's greetings from Leiden. Tom Tyler was 2 years ago in our arena. This is the main hall at Leiden Law. But this Tom Tyler, he studied the phenomenon why do they obey the law? And he came to the conclusion that people obey the law only, and he made it conditional, if they believe it's legitimate. That's not what you do on a daily basis, but that is what you do on a more theoretical level, on a more hypothetical level. So the idea that since we're all Brazilians, we live in Brasilia, that's our state, it's democracy, so the law that comes out of it, and when it's processed through parliament or by the government, the basic understanding is we will abide by it. Because we believe it's legitimate that the Brazilian state does something like this. And we obey the law because we believe it's legitimate, not because we fear punishment. Punishment is, most of the time, for most people, no real actor, no real cause, or no real reason to obey the law. And that's somewhat counterintuitive. You're all students and academics, and your heartbeats remain calm when I say this. But when you say this in a group of politicians, they say, no, it's not true, cannot be true. So if it were up to everybody to decide whether or not the law was legitimate, then we could not have a state. That's not how it works. Still, it was not an idea of Tom Tyler. It was a result of a very big survey. He did over more than 30 years. The last 15 years, the results came out. And he looked at why are people satisfied with a decision, for instance, of a judge whereby they are proved wrong. They do not win their case. Are they satisfied then? Yes, they are, in most cases, if they were heard and could argue their case, then things like that. And he did a lot of these surveys. The one experiment I would like to do with you, so people obey the law if they believe it's legitimate, if they connects to their internal system, test it for yourself. For instance, I'll give you just some examples. I just said now, you are able to abide laws that you do not know, because you have a lot of laws in Brazil. You cannot know them all, so, and we're not all in prison here, so something must have happened that you were able to get the message of the law and comply. But test it for yourself. We all know that littering, throwing garbage down on the road, or jaywalking, passing a red light as a pedestrian, or things like that you should not do that. Has anyone any notion on what the punishment for that is? In the Netherlands, I did one experiment when we did a deregulation program on administrative cost. And we went to municipalities and we asked them, do you know what the penalty is on cutting down a tree. No, they didn't. They said, do you know you need a license for that? Yeah, I didn't know that as well. Do you know how much the license costs? No, no idea. The license cost 60 euro and the fine was 40 euros. So cutting down a tree was profitable for everybody. Asking a license was a very dumb thing. You lost out money. But actually nobody did that. Because that's not what motivates us. That's not what propels us for compliant behavior. Yeah, some people know that and they cut down a tree and they win 20 euros or something like that. But that's not interesting for the most of us. Most of the time we do not know what it costs if we trespass, because that's not our main preoccupation. You just don't know and you just don't care. So punishment is not a very strong motive for obedience to the law and for compliance. Beliefs are very different, and that's why a lot of enforcement strategies try to hint at beliefs, appeal at your belief system. The first strategy, these are the compliance strategies. There are three and even more main enforcement strategies. If there is any enforcement discretion, that's the deterrence strategy, the compliance strategy, and then we have the mixed strategies. And from that we have the tit for tat strategy. That's British. I give you something, you give me something back. Tit for tat. That's bargaining, as it were. Responsive strategy, the carrot stick idea. If you're good, you get the carrot. If you're not, you get the stick. And smart regulation, and then meta regulation and meta risk management. First then, the deterrence strategy. This strategy emphasizes a confrontational style of enforcement and sanctioning of rule-breaking behavior. It assumes that the regulated are rational actors and capable of responding to incentives. And the idea is, if you punish frequent, sufficient, and severe, this will deter potential violators from future offenses. So be very strict. If you look at it, if you only use a deterrence strategy, we know from research that it is not really all that ineffective. It's very costly to do. You cannot have a 100% compliance strategy or a deterrence strategy. You cannot run after everybody in every street. I think they had a 100% deterrence strategy in Stalin's Soviet Union, but not even then, I think. So it is ineffective, and it does not include that most people who trespass do that not from a rational calculation. They do it by accident, or they didn't know, or you have a lot of emotional people around who get angry and do something without thinking. And sometimes you have incompetent actors who just don't know. And sometimes it works counterproductive. If you have a very strict policy, then you can get into a culture of resistance. That's something that happened in a lot of states that now have entered the European Union. In Bulgaria, in Hungary, they did not have peace with the system they lived in, and you get a sort of a dual-layered society. One they call the informal society, and there was a sort of a silent protest against the rules of the oppressors, and they just didn't do it. Like in Greece, they need to give you a tax note, and you need to pay taxes, but when you enter into a shop, you need to get a tax note, and nobody does that. They have a very bad tax morale, but came with very strict penalties. But the deterrence strategy will know very strict, punish very heavily, punish very rapidly, but on its own it is ineffective. This one is the nicest picture I could find. Touching wires causes instant death, And if you do that, and if you're dead, you pay a fine of $200. Newcastle Tramway Authority for you. The second one is the compliance strategy. It emphasizes communication, bargaining, negotiation, and using enforcement and sanctions as a mere threat. Not as a goal in itself, but as a threat. We threaten you with it, and but we try to bargain and negotiate. And we try to prevent harm instead of punishing as a sort of a revenge. And it focuses on cooperation, better regulation between regulator, enforcement agency, and addressee. But again, this one in itself, on its own, is ineffective as well. It is vulnerable to strategic behavior of those not willing to comply. And then we have the mixed theories. I run you through them just to give you an idea of what's around. First of all, the first strategy is not actually a strategy, it's more of a theory. Maybe you've heard of game theory. You can play out the prisoner's dilemma in all kinds of games, nested games. And from that, it came that a tit-for-tat strategy would be very useful for compliance and enforcement strategies. And that means that in this game, the regulator refrains from deterrent action as long as the addressee is cooperating, but the regulator shifts to a deterrent action when the addressee exploits or abuses the regulator and cheats on compliance. But this is a mere strategy, but a mere theory, but we work with it in responsive regulation, which was quite big and is quite big in practice, whereby you reward voluntary compliance, cooperation. You have that you have the best shopkeeper, and you have the best environmental caretaking company of the month, and so sometimes we call that the nudge. Give a little push to help people on the way, and you only so you reward compliance and cooperation. You punish conscious and determined offender, carrot-stick approach. And from it came an idea that was worldwide known. It's called the enforcement pyramid. Maybe you have seen it. But also this strategy has a downside cost and internalization, which you cannot control as a government. I show you the enforcement pyramid. It is from Ayers and Braithwaite, and it is on license system. So somebody needs a license for something, so you have a prohibition, and you only can do this act, say cutting a tree, a big nice tree, you need a license. But say you did not take good care of your tree, and at first somebody comes around and tries to persuade you, please do not cut it. Secondly, if you say, no, next weekend it has to go because we want to have a nice garden and it takes all the shadow of these trees, and you already cut one down, that you get a warning letter from the municipality. Don't do that again, otherwise we will do something against you. And what you can do then is have a civil penalty as well. And then comes the criminal penalty. And then we suspend the license. And then we revoke the license. So it gears up in severity of action. Last two mixed strategies. First of all, smart regulation, in which you try to enter into relations as a government with addressees on a different level. You try to enter them in a contract or give them, inspire self-regulation for a group, or co-regulation. And you use forms of private enforcement to enforce that, or other instruments to improve the overall effectiveness of traditional government action. And you see that a lot in environmental legislation, that people owning large lands, you try to enter into a sort of a contract with them. Last one to be mentioned here, you You see that a lot in the chemical industry is meta-regulation or risk management enforcement. And that is a strategy whereby the government itself does not ward off the risk, but you go to a company and see whether their own systems are okay. Actually, what most governments do is they work on the basis of an administrative logic. Departing from the idea that government is the principal actor to compliance, and that when government makes extra compliance efforts or enforcement efforts, stiffened penalties or heightened sanctions, increased inspection, enforces more, that compliance will increase in more or less a linear way. So if you step up your effort, then you will have better compliance. And for instance, in the Netherlands, we came up with all kinds of toolkits. We have what we call a table of 11, and that is a sort of an annex you can fill out, and then you can see something comes out of a 30% chance of good enforcement. Just fill out the form, and there's a sort of a rule working there, and that 11 dimensions, and you fill it out, and you get that. And we have all kinds of methods in the Netherlands for inspiring good compliance. But as we have seen, there is at best a very uncertain relation between government enforcement and compliance. And we know administrative logic is not always working. I said it's not working, but not always working. It's very costly to do. And that's where and that's the main point I wanted to make, whether better to work also on the basis of the logic of motives, tie in with why people obey the law. A Dutch example of something that went wrong in the Netherlands in practice. In 1990, we had an analysis. We have a tradition in the Netherlands or a culture whereby we think that we are and proud of being a disobedient people. So if you cycle in the Netherlands, you will know that all traffic rules for cyclists are not really taken very seriously. But actually that is the case. So in 1990 there was an analysis in administrative law that we had a lot of enforcement deficit. And this was defined in the strangest way. What is an enforcement deficit? Where you have the capacity in a field, say in environmental law or say in building construction, you have the capacity, but there is still non-compliance. That was the definition of enforcement deficit. And in the daily work of parliamentary debates, most of the time work like this. Somebody holds the government answerable, you have the resources, there is still criminal behavior, so you are not doing your best. You should do something extra. That was defined as a deficit. You have the capacity, and still there is non-compliance. There was a big report headed by my colleague Michiels in 1998. The report was called Quality Enforcement. And it had an approach like the following, the risk-based approach. It said, as a central theme, where there is no enforcement, the risk of non-compliance is substantial. We could all agree to that, couldn't we? If you do, where there is no enforcement, the risk of non-compliance is substantial. Only think it through. He did not do the mathematics on that, but he came with the conclusion that stepping up enforcement efforts were the way to go. So if you had a risk and there was a risk of non-compliance, then efforts, stepping up enforcement efforts would substantially ward off this risk of non-compliance. And this is a perfect circular line of reasoning. Bites his own tail, because there's no evidence. He did not know that. But everybody agreed. It appeals to your intuitions and it appeals to government being able to do all this. But it's a sort of a homeopathic way of thinking. We know it can help, so more of it undoubtedly will help. You know, aspirin In 1950, we knew that it helped against headaches, not how we should dose it, but we did not know how it worked. And we kept eating it, but that's the aspirin effect. It may work, but we don't know how. So that's a big hypothesis for you. This whole program we had on quality enforcement was brutally stopped in 2005 when there was a minister who said, show me the evidence. We have been spending a lot of money on stepping up government effort to enforce. We're 8 years later, I don't see a result. So that was the question whether the emperor had clothes or not. That was what this minister did, and he said the potential of compliance has not yet been realized. But what works then? If we look at the evidence, why do people obey the law and comply? What does work? There is some empirical evidence from criminology, legal economists, and forensic psychology, just to give you some examples on how economic research works there. The first is in economics, and this principal-actor approach had this rational approach, the idea and the deterrence strategy. The people are rational beings, and you play at their rationality. That's the idea that you do that. So if people are rational, in fact, if Homo economicus exists, they can make a cost-benefit analysis on compliance. So weigh the possible loss and the possible losses of trespassing, weigh that against the chance of punishment, against the advantages of non-compliance, like you would weigh, so this is my chance of being caught and getting a fine, but if I trespass, this will be my benefit. I weigh it, and as a rational actor, when the balance comes out, I make my choice. A good colleague of mine, Van Veldhoven, did a study in 1994 where there was a big outrage. He made a study and he calculated with an economic eye and cost-based analysis that crime paid. It did. The actual chance of being caught was so minimal, especially in economic law, that if you wanted to make a profession of it, crime did pay. But that's not, he immediately made the point that people do not work like that. Because that's not the only motive. We're not only motivated by punishment or the fear of punishment or the benefit we can have. Much more important is, like Huisman in 2004 said, that first of all, people are very bad at calculating chances. Much more preoccupied with their social environment. What do other people think of it when I trespass? That's a very big motivator. And can I live with myself if I do that? The internal motive, that is really important. But that's another point from the economic insight. If people are rational beings and do cost-benefit analysis, we know that they terribly bad at calculating their risk. So even for professional criminals, they did study into that in criminology, they always miscalculate the risk. The risk actually is very much higher than they think. It's the subjective risk for professional trespassers that counts. The subjective chance of being caught. And another one is Homo economicus. Again, according to Kassanstein, they just don't exist, econs, as he calls them. Our behavior is also guided by predictable, irrational choices as well. A quick view on forensic psychology. What is the role of the threat of punishment in, for instance, tax law compliance? Elfers and Hessing, who is a Swede in 1997, looked into that. 3 groups they distinguished. First of all, you have sanctions are ineffective for conformist compliers. And what are conformist compliers? That are those people that only comply with the law for fear of punishment. And there is only an effect for them if there is certain quick and severe punishment, very quickly after facts. Then the biggest group, this is only 5% in their test group, the biggest group. Sanctions have an indirect effect on identifiers. And those are the people who comply because they want to belong to a certain group and they follow the models in a group. So if they see others being sanctioned, that helps. That underlines the norm. That reminds them of the norm. So they are very sensible of others being punished. And they're very much ashamed if they themselves get punished. And then the last group, so the second group was about 30%, and the last group is in the 60%, that sanctions are superfluous, as we sit here, most of us, for the internalizers. You don't need sanctions to remind us of laws we don't know what it is. So these internalizers are people who comply with the rules because they have made it part of their own worldview. And that's the biggest group. Conclusion. If you want to catch or inspire compliant behavior in the very small group of the people that only follow the law because fear of punishment, you have to have a visible and reactive actual punishment that impresses the relevant rule on our minds and programs our willingness to comply. And I've called that the bandwagon effect. If we see somebody punished, that's what we are very sensible to. Actually, that's something that they train in the Netherlands. You have people handing out parking tickets as well. So police officers, or do you have special agents for that? In the Netherlands, we are a small country and we have a lot of cars and big traffic and parking problems. And then they train these traffic agents on how they can hint at people's belief following this scheme, the bandwagon effect. If you, some of you maybe have been in Amsterdam, where you have canals and a lot of illegal parking. If a traffic agent would go there at 11 o'clock in the morning, then he would have his work cut out for him because he can work until 4 writing out tickets. It's not helpful. And people come back and are mad and they tear up the ticket and they have to pay anyway and they stop the Schiphol, things like that. But the thing that really works is to be very early in the morning there. So the first car parks illegally. Then you make a wide gesture. You walk to it. And then other people are driving cars as well. You take out your ticket book. And with wide gestures, you write the ticket. And you look at the car. And you look in the back. And you walk around it. There will be no cars standing for the whole morning. Psychology, the last one. Very nice experiment by Anderson and Daly. They asked more than 10,000 respondents in the United States why they comply with the law, but especially to people who had trespassed, who were in prison. They asked a lot of prisoners as well. And most of these respondents indicate that they themselves refrain from non-compliance as a result of internal factors, morality and internalization, not in fear of punishment. And the people who are in prison, most of them had what they call sob stories. Something happened, something went wrong, they got angry, they made a mistake, but they were not willfully trespassing the rules. A small group of hardened criminals said, it's my profession, that's why I do it. I'm in it for the benefit, I got caught, when they release me, I will do it again. I'm not an internalizer. But there was only a very, very tiny group. A big group in prison was being educated at being professional, but let's leave it at that. But even prisoners said it. But now comes the thing on how we work with law. So asked 10,000 respondents, one-on-one, Anderson and Daly said, Why are you complying with the law? And they gave the honest answer, because I'm morally convinced. That's the good thing. I'm an internalizer. Then they asked, do you think that your fellow citizens have the same inclination? That they, like you, are only restrained from non-compliance, they're restrained from non-compliance because they are morally convinced as well? No, said everybody. No, 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 no. I'm morally convinced, but other people need to be deterred because I cannot trust them, that they will follow, that they are the same like me. We do not readily trust that our fellow citizens will have the same idea. And that's what we call differential attributions, and that's a distrust. That's how we work. We do not really trust that other people are the same like us. But this is a big phenomenon in, for instance, criminal law, because we do distrust other people. We think only when we enforce really strictly and have high penalties, they will be convinced and deterred from doing it. But in all likelihood, they will never know what the penalty is. They will be internalizers like you. And so that is an effective strategy. In conclusion, I come to a conclusion. I have 3 conclusions. First of all, the big question, does criminal law, for instance, or administrative sanctions for that matter, does it deter? Does stiffening penalties help? Does increasing enforcement help? No, not as such, not as a standalone action. You cannot rely on a deterrence strategy alone. It will not help, because that's not the way we work. Secondly, recent behavioral science insight learns that, Robertson and Daly said it again, that potential offenders commonly do not know the legal rules, be it directly or indirectly. You just don't know all the rules. It's not all that relevant, it's not a big drama, but you just don't know it. It's not your prime motive to act according to the law. And even if they know, most of them commonly cannot use this knowledge in their own best interest, due to a variety of social, situational, or chemical influences. And that's not all drugs, what is meant there, but we get emotional. It's a chemical influence, sometimes. And then things happen. That is the common criminal for you. Something happened, not willfully trespassing the law. There are hardened criminals, they are a big problem, they make life very hard for us, I do avow of all that, but the big bulk of people will not be impressed by having very severe sanctions thrown at them. They just don't know. So deterrence alone, I'm not saying that deterrence is not a big element, but on its own it will not help. We need to have to tie in with the motives of legal subjects as well, by nudges, communication, carrot, stick, social stigma. That's not a nice thing, but if you can convince society that it is immoral to do something, that's what you can do as a governor as well, that will be more effective than trying to enforce it. We had an incident in the Netherlands, but they have it now everywhere. There was the ban on smoking. So first you couldn't smoke in public theaters, but then it got to little cafes and restaurants, a ban on smoking. And there was a big resistance. And then we tried to control this ban, and there was resistance, and they took it to the courts, and it did not fall down. And then government did the following. Listen, there are people working there. They will die if you smoke. We cannot control it. Supreme Court has ruled against it. Be our guest, kill people. That's not the way we work in the Netherlands. That would be an American message, but they try to play at the moral sense. And most restaurants and cafes in the Netherlands have a voluntary smoking ban at this moment. So just working at the morals. Appealing to the beliefs, appealing to morality and educate. It's a very strong element. Second conclusion, administrative efforts do not equate compliancy rates. Not one-on-one. That's disheartening, but that's what it is. And then third, element overlooked, and you can use in day-to-day practice, is that the threat of punishment does not directly act as a motive for compliance, but rather indirectly, the bandwagon effect, jump on the bandwagon. We want to belong to a social group, we want to be socially acceptable, and you can use that as a government. So compliant behavioral enforcement activities that demonstrate or remind us of the existence of a norm prompt more compliant behavior. And that simply stiffening penalties or increasing enforcement does not. That was what I wanted to share with you. Thank you for your kind attention.